I'll give you another example of this. This is a Whole Foods, pulled an ad for Whole Foods in Greenville, South Carolina on Woodruff Road, where they are sponsoring every Saturday in their parking lot a farmer's market. Now, what does Whole Foods sell? They sell fresh food. Who do they compete with? Well, one of their competitors is a farmer's market. So what they're basically doing is hosting their competition in their own parking lot. But they're doing so because they know that the locus of value for Whole Foods nowadays is more rooted in interactions and the process and the way in which you treat people than it is the product or the experience of going in the store per se. And so what they're doing is creating an environment where people can come and interact with one another. So when I talk about a social economy or a social world or a world of products with social attributes, I'm not just talking about Facebook. I'm talking about the broader dynamic, which is that social relationships and community and engagement with one another matters more than ever. And remember, service is an idea about how brands relate to people. Interactions is an idea about how people relate to one another. So this whole idea that we can maximize process by emphasizing service misses the point. People don't want to have a relationship with your brand. They find that idea to be laughable. A relationship with a brand? Are you kidding me? You know, that's just marketers talking more of their marketing BS. That doesn't matter to me at all. What people want are relationships with other people. And they want brands that will facilitate and make available those kinds of interactions, like a brand that puts its competition in its own parking lot in order to facilitate the ability of people to connect with one another. In fact, I'll reprise one slide from last year just to kind of emphasize this point again. When we talk about the context of the past, we talk about materialism as providing the context for meaning, where materialism was sort of the overarching context for everything we're interested in our lives. When we look at the context of the future, no less materialism, but we are going to make all of those material decisions and choices within a broader context of meaning. And what defines meaning for people, and social psychologists have found this repeatedly in all of their research, is relationships with others. It's not, by the way, a relationship with a brand. It's relationships with other people. That's the number one predictor of happiness. That's the number one predictor of life satisfaction. It is the thing that engages people most in the ways in which they build their lifestyles. And increasingly, that's what people are looking for in their lives, and that's what they want from brands. And we see this everywhere. You know, measuring happiness is now the activity du jour for governments around the world. So Nicolas Sarkozy in France got 3 Nobel Prize winning economists to come up with an alternative measure of life, of well-being to GDP. You know, he didn't think this economic measure fully captured everything that he should try to do as the leader of France to maximize the well-being of citizens in the country of France. And they've published what they discovered in a book called Mismeasuring Our Lives. The same thing's going on in the UK. David Cameron, for all his austerity measures and his unpopularity with many people on the left, has said the UK government has a responsibility to measure the happiness of people in the UK, and the government has to take on as a responsibility doing things to increase the level of happiness in that country. They measure it in Canada. This is the cover of a report about happiness level in one of the provinces, and it is something that the OECD has a separate initiative on around the world. And you know happiness is a big deal here too, right? Because in 2008, Oprah Winfrey published Oprah's Big Book of Happiness. So if Oprah does it, it must be a big trend. And in fact, back in 2008, in the same year, Writer's Digest, that sort of Bible for people who try to make their living publishing books, told writers how to capture the hottest trend in book publishing right now. And that trend was books about happiness. That's what it's about. And so it's no surprise that we see Zappos delivering happiness. Did you know, by the way, that Zappos sells shoes? You know, if you just listen to Zappos talk, you'd think they sell happiness and deliver it in a box to your house. Coca-Cola talks about open happiness. Different idea about happiness, but it's the same language, and it's rooted in a lot of the same ideas. And the John Lewis Partnership in the UK, which is a retailer cooperative, has made happiness core to their business proposition. Not their marketing proposition, but the way they run their business. Happiness of their customers is one thing they try to emphasize, happiness of their employees is another, and they have a chief happiness officer. All about happiness in today's marketplace. And it is happiness and this focus on relationships and this emphasis on process that is really driven by these kind of three elements that I talked about at the outset. The first of which are these market conditions that we face nowadays. A smaller economy and a level of volatility that we haven't seen in a long time. So I'm not going to show you a lot of economic charts here, but I am going to show you just a couple to make this point. And the first one I want to show you is real personal consumption expenditures trended since 1994. And in fact, if you were to trend this back to when the Fed started tracking this way back when, in the late 1940s, you would see an uninterrupted straight line curve until you got to the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. And then you saw this dip. And now we're growing again. And in fact, we're reading in newspaper headlines day after day right now about these nascent signs of recovery. And there is absolutely no doubt that the economy looks better now than it has for the last couple of years. But let's get real, right? The economy's getting better, but it's not getting back to what we thought it was going to be. It is bigger than it used to be, but it's not on the same trend line. And this difference between the trend line that we're on and the trend line that we were on is referred to by economists as the output gap. And the output gap represents the amount of unutilized capacity in our economy, the most obvious expression of which is unemployment. And despite all the good signs that we've seen in the economy of late, you know, the current GDP forecast for the U.S., the latest revisions, are by and large below 2% for the year. And 2% GDP growth in the U.S. economy is considered the minimum necessary to create enough jobs to keep up with population growth. So yes, we're going to see some improvement, but we're still going to be living in a smaller economy with a lot of underutilized capacity for some time to come. And this is inherent to financial crises. There is nothing that any president can do about it. We just have to live with it. And as soon as we get rid of all the debt, the economy will begin to recover, as it always does after financial crises. But for now, we are living with a smaller economy, which means people have a little less money to spend, and they're prioritizing in different ways. And they're prioritizing in the context of more volatility. So I want to ask you to just, sort of think to yourself here for a second and ask yourself if any of this sounds familiar. Sound familiar? Financial crisis, bailouts, sovereign debt crises, jobless recovery, wars and terrorism, historic tsunamis, civil uprisings, anti-globalization protests, rising commodity prices. Sound familiar? Sound familiar? Yeah. That was the period from 1987 to 2007, otherwise known as the Great Moderation. Now, the reason that sounds familiar to you is because every single one of those things has happened since 2007. There's no difference between everything that's happened between 2007 and everything that happened before 2007. In fact, right after the Japanese tsunami, Calculated Risk blog, one of my favorite economics blogs, which has no ideological bent one way or the other, they just sort of publish charts, but every now and then they step back and say, gee, let's just kind of take a look at what we're seeing. And right after the Japanese tsunami, 3 days after, in fact, they said, you know what, let's just kind of look at the world through the eyes of consumers. And what is it that consumers are dealing with these days? And this is their crisis fatigue list. Historic tsunami, rising commodity prices and civil uprisings, housing crisis, falling prices and foreclosures, sovereign debt crises, bailouts and government cutbacks and austerity programs, the possibility of inflation, which hasn't manifested itself yet, thank goodness, not to mention high enduring unemployment. This is the context within which consumers are living. But this context really is no different than what we used to live in. The difference is how we feel about it. The difference lies in our sense of confidence and control. And let me just give you an illustration of what I mean by that. Back in 2003, Nobel Prize-winning economist, University of Chicago economist Robert Lucas took over as the president of the American Economic Association. And in his presidential address, he began in his first paragraph by saying that the central problem of macroeconomics has been solved. He noted that macroeconomics was a field that came of age after the Great Depression, and its primary purpose was to prevent another Great Depression. And he said in 2003, we've solved that problem. Time to move on and study something else. And then the financial crisis occurred. And if not for timely governmental intervention around the world, and not just by the U.S. and the U.K. and European countries, but also by China and Brazil and other emerging nations, which also had enormous programs of bailouts and infusion of cash into their economies as well, we would have gone through another Great Depression. That's the sense of confidence that we had during all of this stuff. You know, it was kind of like, I don't care what happens, we know how to deal with it. We have control over our future, irrespective of what happens. And then the financial crisis occurs, and all these same things happen. And then last year, Ben Bernanke was said, why is the recovery so stagnant? And he goes, I have no clue. That's the sense of confidence and control that we have today. We feel like the world is out of control. And it's this kind of volatility, more than any kind of economic crisis or financial crisis affecting consumers, that is really driving a lot of the cutbacks in spending.